My line had been out for maybe an hour when the boat on the other side of the lake cut its engine. I watched the running light sit there, orange and still, maybe 200 yards off the opposite bank. I did not think much of it. Other people fish at night. I baited a second hook and set my second rod in the holder and listened to the frogs. The light was gone when I looked up again. I assumed he had drifted behind the tree line or just killed the light to reduce glare. That is what I told myself. The frogs had stopped though, and the water was very flat, and I became aware that I could hear my own breathing. Then something crossed the far bank. Not through the water, along it. Moving parallel to the shore at a pace that was almost leisurely, like someone out for a walk, except that the bank over there is pure cattail marsh for a quarter mile in either direction. I know because I asked about it at the bait shop the next morning. The man behind the counter did not answer me right away. He bagged my split shot sinkers and looked out the window and said the fishing was better on the south end and that I ought to try the south end next time. I drove back to town and stopped for gas and mentioned it to the woman running the register. She had the same pause, the same redirect. Talked about the weather. Asked where I was from. I have told this to 3 people who live in that town and gotten the same pause from each of them, that specific quiet, before they changed the subject. None of them have asked me what I saw. Our next story. The ping came through at 11:47, which was unusual for a Tuesday in Grover Falls because nothing in Grover Falls was open past 9. I accepted it anyway, pulled out of the gas station lot, and followed the GPS down Route 9 toward a pickup address I did not recognize, a rural mailbox number on a road called Siller Creek Path. The fare was a woman, maybe 60, with a canvas bag and sensible shoes. She got in without a word and gave me a destination, a motel on the highway 12 miles north. Normal enough. What was not normal was how she sat. Perfectly still, facing forward, hands folded in her lap, the way people sit when they are concentrating on not looking at something. About 4 miles in, we passed a turnoff marked with a cluster of sun-bleached ribbons tied to a fence post. I mentioned I had never driven this road before, just making conversation. She said nothing. I asked how long she had lived in the area. She said she did not anymore. Then she asked me very quietly not to stop the car for any reason between here and the highway. Her voice was pleasant. Matter of fact. I laughed a little and said, of course, no stops, and she nodded like we had agreed on something serious. We passed another fence post. More ribbons. A third one a mile after that. I asked her what they were for. She looked at her hands and said that some of the people who used to live out here had a habit of walking at night, and the ribbons helped folks remember to keep driving. We reached the motel. She paid in cash and was gone before I thought to ask anything else. I drove home on the highway. Our next story. I was mopping the 3rd floor hallway when I noticed the trophy case was open. Not broken, not forced. Just standing open, the little magnetic latch undone, the glass door swung back a few inches. I figured one of the afternoon custodians had left it that way, so I swung it shut and moved on. I was almost to the stairwell when I heard it open again behind me. I turned around. The hallway was empty. The trophy case was open again, the same few inches, and I remember standing there with the mop handle in both hands just watching it, waiting for a draft to explain it. There was no draft. This is an old building and nothing moves in it that does not want to. I asked Terrence about it the next morning, the head of facilities, a man who has worked this school for 22 years. He went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with thinking. He said some things in old buildings just do that. I said I thought maybe the latch was loose. He nodded and changed the subject, and I noticed he did not look at me directly after that. I went back that night and looked at the trophies through the glass. Most of them were ordinary. Track and field, debate, basketball back to the 70s. But on the middle shelf there was a gap, a visible gap in the dust where something had sat for a long time and then been removed. The felt beneath it was a deeper green than the rest, protected all those years from the light. Whatever had been there, someone had taken it out of the case and never put it back. The latch, I checked it that night. It was perfectly fine. Our next story. The radio on the desk clicked 3 times, the way it always did when someone keyed a mic and then thought better of it. I logged it as dead air, the way Frank had taught me, and went back to scanning the tree line with the binoculars. Frank was the one who had trained me for the lookout position back in March. He was also the one who stopped returning my calls sometime around the 2nd week of June. The county coordinator said he took a leave of absence. She said it the way people say something when they have practiced not saying more. I had been up in the tower 6 hours when I saw the light. Not a fire, nothing orange or spreading. A white light like a lantern, moving in a straight line through the eastern quadrant about 2 miles out. Steady pace. I logged it and called it in on the radio. The ranger on duty said she would note it. Her voice was completely flat. The light stopped moving. Then it went out. An hour later it came back on, closer. Maybe a mile out now. Still that same steady, unhurried pace. I watched it until my eyes ached, and then I set down the binoculars and just sat with my coffee getting cold. I drove down the access road after my shift and stopped at the gas station on Route 9 to fill up. The man behind the counter had a beard going gray and a look that placed him here his whole life. I told him what I had seen. I described the light, the direction, the distance. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said the eastern quadrant has always been like that. He did not ask me to explain what I meant. Our next story. Biscuit stopped walking at the same spot every morning, right in front of the old Mercer house on Aldine Street. Not slowing down, not sniffing the grass. Stopped. All 4 legs locked, ears flat, staring at the dark bay window like he was reading something written on the glass. I would give the leash a little tug and he would come, but he always looked back twice. I figured it was a cat inside, or maybe the smell of something dead under the porch. Dogs find reasons. Then one morning, Mrs. Holt from 2 blocks over was out getting her paper early, and she watched me pull Biscuit away from the Mercer house, and she said quietly, not quite looking at me, that I should try a different route. I asked her why. She said the street was just easier on the other side of the park. I said it added 10 minutes, and I had 6 dogs to walk before 7. She nodded and went inside without another word. I started noticing that nobody on Aldine Street ever put their trash cans at the curb on that side of the block. I checked for weeks. Every can was rolled out to the opposite corner, a long walk for some of those older houses. Like they had all agreed on it years ago without making a fuss. I asked my boss if anyone lived in the Mercer place. She said she thought so, she thought a family, and then she changed the subject to scheduling and never came back to it. Last Tuesday Biscuit stopped again, and this time I stood still and let him look. The curtain in the window moved, and there were no lights on inside. Our next story. The snow had been falling for 3 days, and I had memorized every corner of the rental cabin by the 2nd afternoon. That was when I noticed the notebook. It was tucked between the radiator and the wall, the kind with a black and white marbled cover, and I pulled it out mostly for something to read. Inside were names. 20, maybe 30 of them, first names only, written in different hands. Under each name was a date spanning back about 15 years, and a number. The numbers were all between 1 and 9. I figured it was a guest book, something the owners started and let guests add to. But there was no context, no welcome message, no little drawings of mountains. Just names, dates, and a single digit beside each one. I set it on the kitchen table and went back to watching the snow. Around 7 that evening, the plows finally pushed through, and the woman who ran the property management company called to check on me. I mentioned the notebook lightly, as though it was a funny thing I had found. There was a pause before she said anything. She told me to leave it on the table and that she would collect it personally when the road cleared. Her voice was the same careful flat tone I have heard from people who are deciding exactly how much to say. I asked her what the numbers meant. She said it had been a tradition before her time and that she did not fully understand it herself. Then she changed the subject to the forecast. I looked down at the notebook. I found the entry from 3 days before my booking. Someone had written a name I did not recognize and the digit 5. The previous entry had my name. Our next story. Room 6 had been empty for 11 days when the call light came on. I noticed it from the nurse's station, that soft amber glow above the door, and I assumed maintenance had bumped the panel again. Third time that week. I walked down, hit the reset button, and went back to my charts. An hour later it came on again. I checked the room this time. Bare mattress, no pillow, the window cracked the way housekeeping always leaves them. Nothing. I stood there a moment listening to the building settle around me, and then I reset it from inside the room and left. The charge nurse, Beverly, came in at 4 to drop off some paperwork, and I mentioned it to her, more to make conversation than anything. She stopped writing. She asked me which room. I told her 6. She nodded slowly and said the panel in that room had always been temperamental, which was a strange thing to say because the panel in that room was replaced in January. I had signed the maintenance log myself. I asked Beverly if something had happened in that room before I transferred here. She said no. I asked her why she looked like that when I told her the number. She said she didn't look like anything. In the morning, I checked the admission records going back 4 years, just out of curiosity. Room 6 had been occupied hundreds of times, normal rotation, except for a single gap of 8 months starting in the spring of 2019. No explanation in the notes. No notation at all, actually. The date simply skipped, the way a page skips when one has been torn out cleanly. I asked 2 other nurses about it later that week. Neither one of them remembered that stretch of time. Our next story. The guest in room 9 checked out at 2 in the morning, which happens more than you would think. I printed his receipt, slid it under the door, and went back to my crossword. What I noticed maybe 10 minutes later was that his car was still in the lot. I figured he forgot something. People do. I waited for him to come back to the desk, but nobody came, and the car sat there under the yellow lot light with the engine off. Around 3, I called the room out of habit, just to make sure I had not missed a checkout cancellation. No answer, which made sense. He was gone. His key was on the desk in front of me. The strange part came when I pulled up his reservation to close it out. The name on the booking was Gerald Foss. And when I mentioned that name the next morning, just casually, to Diane, who opens the diner across the street, she set down her coffee pot and looked at me the way you look at a child who has said something they should not know. She said she did not know anybody by that name. Then she went to the back and did not come out again before I left. I asked Pete at the hardware store 2 days later, same name, same response. Not unfriendly exactly. Just a door closing behind their eyes. I went back through our records last week looking for Gerald Foss. The reservation was there, the payment processed, the room logged as occupied. But when I scrolled to the scanned copy of his ID, the image was just a white rectangle. The car, I realized, had been gone when I looked up from that receipt. I had never seen it live. Our next story. The package for 4 Aldermore Lane had been sitting in my cab since 6, and by the time I found the turnoff, it was almost 11. The road was unpaved past the mailboxes, which the app had not mentioned, so I drove slow with my window down listening for the address markers on the posts. Gravel popping under the tires. Crickets. The usual. I found number 4 at the end of a short drive, a single-story house with 1 lamp burning in the front window, and I grabbed the box and walked up. There was a woman already standing on the porch. She was maybe 60, arms crossed, watching me come up the path like she had been waiting a long time. I said her name to confirm the delivery, and she flinched, actually flinched, like I had said something wrong. She took the box without signing, without a word, and went inside and shut the door. I did not think much of it. Rural routes, you get all kinds. But when I pulled back out onto the main road, my next stop was the gas station in Aldermore proper, and the kid behind the counter saw my company vest and asked which roads I had been on tonight. I told him. He looked at the register for a second. He said that house burned down in 2009. Family of 3. He said nobody lives out on that lane, said the town had been trying to get the lot cleared for years, but nobody would go near it after dark. I showed him the delivery confirmation on my scanner. The address. The timestamp. The weight registered when she took the box from my hands. He looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at me and said, "We know." Our next story. The pump on Bay 3 kicked on by itself again. Third night in a row. No car out there, no card in the reader, just the numbers rolling on the display like someone was filling up. I walked out and checked the way I always did, and the hose was still hung, the concrete still dry. I reset it from the panel inside and went back to my coffee. Around 2, I noticed the same truck had been sitting at the far edge of the lot for about 40 minutes. Old white pickup, no plates I could make out. I figured it was somebody sleeping one off, which happens, so I left it alone. When I looked again at 2:30, it was gone, but there was a road atlas sitting on top of the outside trash can. Spread open, pages down, like somebody had just set it there mid-read. I mentioned it to Dale when he came in at 6 for the shift change. He looked at the atlas in my hand and then at the floor, and he said to just throw it out. I asked him if that kind of thing happened often, and he gave me the particular silence that people here use instead of answering. I had been in Carver Fork long enough to recognize it. Later that morning, I stopped at the diner for breakfast and brought it up with Meredith behind the counter, described the truck, the atlas, the pump going on its own. She filled my cup without looking up and said the graveyard shift at that station had turned over 9 times in 3 years. I thought about that on the drive home. The atlas was open to the county map, and someone had circled the station in red pen. Our next story. The truck stop outside Henley Falls had one functioning bathroom, a vending machine that only sold one brand of chips, and a hand-lettered sign above the register that said no questions about the water tower. I noticed it because that is a strange thing to put on a sign. The woman behind the counter was already looking at her phone when I asked her about it, and she just shook her head once without looking up. The kind of shake that means the conversation is over before it started. I took my coffee outside and sat on the hood of my rig. You could see the water tower from the lot, maybe a quarter mile off. Old painted green, the kind every small town has. Except someone had welded a ladder cage over the original ladder, and the cage had a padlock on it, and there was a light up near the tank that was not a warning light. It was pointed inward, toward the tower itself, like whatever needed watching was on the structure and not in the sky. A local guy came out to smoke and stood near my bumper. I asked him about the tower the casual way, just making conversation. He lit his cigarette and looked off toward the tree line and told me they had some vandalism a few years back. Kids, nothing serious. I said that seemed like a lot of hardware for some kids. He said, "Yeah, I guess so," and went back inside. When I pulled out around 2 in the morning, I swung my high beams across the tower out of habit, the way you check your mirrors before merging. In the second before I straightened the wheel, I saw the light up near the tank flicker, like something had passed between it and me. The padlocked cage was on the outside. Our next story. Apartment 4B had been vacant for 6 weeks when I started hearing the television. Not loud, not disruptive, just the low murmur of voices through the shared wall beside my bed. I figured the landlord had finally rented it. I figured I would meet a new neighbor soon. I went back to sleep. A week passed and I never heard a door. Never heard footsteps in the hall, never smelled coffee in the morning, never crossed paths with anyone on the stairs. But every night around 11 the voices came through the wall, same low register, same unbroken rhythm, like a program stuck on one channel. I asked Mrs. Poole downstairs about it. She runs the building for the owner and has lived here since before the carpets were installed. She told me 4B was still empty and changed the subject so smoothly, I almost missed that she had done it. I asked again 2 days later, casually, and she said the same thing and turned to refill her kettle with her back to me. I started pressing my ear to the wall. The voices never resolved into words, just that patient, rolling murmur, 2 or 3 of them, comfortable with each other, unhurried. One night I knocked on the wall once, firmly, the way you knock to tell a neighbor to keep it down. The voices stopped. There was a long silence, and then something knocked back, 3 times, slow and deliberate, from lower on the wall than I had knocked, closer to the floor. I went to the landlord's office the next morning to ask who had lived in 4B before it went vacant. Mrs. Poole looked at me for a moment before she answered. She said nobody had lived there in a very long time, and that most people just learned not to knock. Our next story. The wallpaper in the east bedroom came off in long, satisfying strips, and I was 3 hours into the job when I found the names. They were written directly on the plaster underneath, in pencil, in a column. 7 names, all with the same last name, Greer, and a date beside each one. The dates ran from 1961 to 1979, each entry about 2 years apart. I took a photo and moved on, assuming it was some family record, the kind of thing old houses are full of. I mentioned it to the woman at the hardware store the next morning, a Mrs. Patton, who had been helpful about everything else, grout, primer, which contractor to avoid. When I described the names, she stopped moving. She set down the paint stirrer in her hand and said the store was about to get busy, even though I was the only customer, and that was the end of it. I tried the county assessor's office. The woman there told me the Greer family had sold the property in 1980 and relocated. When I asked where, she said she wasn't sure that information was current. She smiled the whole time, pleasantly, professionally, and did not look at my face once. That night I pulled up the county obituary archive. 7 Greers. Same last name as the list. The dates of death matched the dates on the wall almost exactly, each one off by only a few weeks. All listed as accidental. All on the same property. I went back to the east bedroom with a flashlight and looked more carefully at the plaster below the names. There was an 8th entry, the pencil lighter, like whoever wrote it had less strength by then. The handwriting matched the others. Our next story. The address book in the kitchen drawer had every local number crossed out except one, and I only noticed because I was bored enough to snoop. I had been hired through one of those house-sitting apps, 3 weeks in a place called Creel, population maybe 800, watching a farmhouse while the owners were abroad. The work was nothing. Water the plants, collect the mail, make sure the pipes stayed warm. On the 4th day I walked down to the gas station to buy coffee and mentioned to the woman behind the counter that I was staying at the Aldrich place on Route 9. She handed me my change without looking up and said she hoped the rest of my stay was quiet. I thought that was just small-town flat effect. People out here were not unfriendly, exactly. They just seemed to be waiting for you to finish your sentence. Back at the house that night, I looked at the address book again. Every name had been crossed through with a single neat line, the kind you draw with a ruler. The one number left uncrossed had no name beside it, just the number and a small penciled note underneath that read, "Call if it comes back." I told myself the owners had probably moved, updated their contacts, left this old book behind without thinking. Then I found the photographs in the hall closet, maybe 30 of them bundled with a rubber band, all taken from the same upstairs window, all showing the same stretch of the back field at what looked like the same hour of night. In every single one of them, there was a figure standing at the tree line. In the last photograph, the figure was considerably closer. The date stamped on that last photo was 3 days before I arrived. Our next story. Every door on the 4th floor was supposed to be locked by 9, so finding room 412 standing open at midnight stopped me cold. I pushed it wider with my flashlight. Empty office, same as always. A chair pulled back from a desk, a coffee mug someone had forgotten, the blinds angled down toward the parking lot. Nothing alarming. I chalked it up to the day crew leaving in a hurry and logged it in my notebook. I finished the floor and took the stairs down to 3. The door to 412 was open again when I came back up 20 minutes later. I know I closed it. I heard the latch click. I stood there in the hallway looking at that thin rectangle of dark and told myself the mechanism was faulty, told myself old buildings breathe, told myself a lot of things while I walked back toward it. The coffee mug had moved. It was on the windowsill now, facing out. I radioed the front desk, and Terrence, who had worked that building for 11 years, went quiet for a long moment before he said to just finish my rounds and not worry about 412. His voice had that particular flatness people use when they have decided a long time ago not to discuss something. In the morning, I asked the property manager about the room. She told me it had been used for storage since 2019 and that no tenant had ever occupied it. I mentioned the mug, and she looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something embarrassing at a dinner party. I pulled the building directory that afternoon. The old one laminated from 2018. Suite 412 was listed under a name. Gerald Voss Consulting. A local number printed beneath it, and a checkout date filled in by hand. The date was the day Gerald Voss died, according to the obituary I found an hour later. The cause of death was listed as unknown. Our next story. The shortcut through Delaware Road shaved 8 minutes off my walk home, and I had taken it every night for 3 weeks without thinking twice about it. That Tuesday I noticed the flowers. They were laid at the base of the telephone pole on the corner of Delaware and Marsh, the kind of arrangement you see at roadside memorials, plastic-wrapped carnations, and a laminated photo gone soft at the edges from the rain. I slowed down to look. The photo showed a girl maybe my age, dark hair, a yellow jacket. No name on it. No date. Just the photo and the flowers and a small handwritten card I could not read in the dark. I mentioned it to my coworker Priya the next day, and she got very quiet. She said that pole had always had flowers on it for as long as she had lived here. She did not say anything else, and she turned back to the register. I started paying attention on my walks after that. New flowers appeared every few days, always fresh, always that same arrangement. Someone was tending it. One night I stayed a few minutes, just standing near the pole, and a woman came out of the house directly across the street. She stood on her porch and watched me without speaking until I left. I went to the county library and searched the local paper archives for Delaware Road and Marsh Street. There was nothing. No accident report, no obituary, no letter to the editor. A clean gap in the record, like someone had gone through and lifted the pages out. The girl in the photo is wearing a yellow jacket. I have seen that jacket hanging on a hook inside the diner where I work. It has been there since my first shift. Our next story. Aunt Clara's neighbor brought food over on my 3rd day there, a casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel, and she handed it through the screen door without stepping inside. I thanked her and mentioned I had found some of Clara's old photographs I wanted to ask about, neighbors, local landmarks, that kind of thing. She smiled and said she really had to get back, and she was gone before I could say another word. I thought she was just shy. The photographs were the strange part. Clara had lived in Morden for 40 years and kept albums going back to the 70s, and every single one of them had the same gap. The years between 1988 and 1991 were simply not there. No loose prints in the shoebox, no negatives in the desk, just nothing. 3 years cut cleanly out of a life that had documented everything else: birthday parties, garden progress, a new fence being built. I asked about it at the hardware store when I went for boxes. The man behind the counter looked at me the way you look at a child who has asked something embarrassing, patient and closed at the same time. He said Clara was a private woman. I said I was her niece and I was clearing out her house. He found something to do on the other side of the store. That night I went through her address book and called 2 people who were listed under family friends. One number was disconnected. The other woman picked up, and when I told her I was staying at Clara's, she went completely quiet and then said, very carefully, that she hoped I was only planning to stay the week. I asked her why. She said that house has a way of making people curious. She hung up, and I realized Clara had lived there alone for 32 years and never once had a visitor listed in any of her journals. Our next story. She called in at 11:52, same woman, same number, 3rd night running. I had her on the log already. Patris Odom, Rural Route 4, the old Belmer property outside Crail. Each night she reported the same thing, a man standing at the edge of her field. Each night I dispatched, and each night the deputy radioed back that there was nothing out there, just the tree line and the dark. On the 4th night she did not call. I noticed because the board was quiet and I was watching the clock. I pulled her address and almost called to check in, which is not really something we do, but something felt off about the silence after 3 nights of her voice. I left it alone. Around 2 in the morning I ran the address through the county system, just to occupy myself. The Belmer property had 18 prior calls logged over the past 9 years. All the same. All a woman reporting a figure at the field's edge. The reporting party name changed every few years, different women, same address. I flagged the deputy on shift and read him the log. He went quiet for a moment and then said that the Belmer place had been a women's shelter for a while, back in the 90s, before it closed. He said it like that explained something. I said, explained what? He said he had to finish his route. I tried calling Patris Odom the next morning before my shift ended. The line rang twice and a man answered. His voice was flat and careful. He told me no one by that name lived there, that he had owned the property for 6 years, and that I had the wrong number. The call log still shows her number dialing out from that address. Our next story. The fire had burned down to coals when I heard the first set of footsteps circle my tent. Not twigs snapping, not the casual brush of a deer moving through. These were deliberate, evenly spaced, walking a slow ring around my campsite and stopping somewhere behind me where the tree line started. I told myself it was a hiker who had wandered off trail. I told myself it was nothing. I unzipped the tent and held my flashlight out, and there was no one there, just the dark between the pines and the smell of something I could not place, almost like wet paper. I drove into the closest town the next morning for water. A gas station, a diner, a row of houses with the curtains pulled. I mentioned to the woman at the register that I was camped up near the old fire road, and she stopped moving. Just stopped, her hand on the counter. She said that road had been gated off for years. I told her the gate was open. She did not respond to that. She gave me my change and looked past me at the door until I left. I went back to the campsite because I had paid for 3 nights, and I am stubborn about things like that. My gear was exactly as I had left it. Except the camp chair I had folded and leaned against my car was now sitting open, facing the trees, as if someone had been sitting there all morning waiting for me to come back. I packed in under an hour and drove out without stopping. I looked it up when I got home. That fire road shows up on maps from 15 years ago and nowhere after that. No explanation. No incident report. Just gone from every record, like the county decided to stop acknowledging it existed. Our next story. The Hargrove kids went down easy, both of them asleep by 8, and I settled onto the couch with my homework and the television on low. The house was the kind of quiet you stop noticing after a while. I was maybe an hour into a calculus problem when I realized the TV had been showing the same local news segment on a loop, a 2-minute clip about a road closure on Miller Bend, playing again and again without cutting to anything else. I figured the station was having technical trouble and turned it off. Around 10, I went to the kitchen for water and noticed the photograph on the refrigerator. It was one of those school picture magnets, 2 kids in front of a blue backdrop, smiling. Except it was not either of the Hargrove children. I had spent enough time at that house to know their faces, and these were different kids, a boy and a girl maybe a year younger, with the same shaped eyes but somehow off. I told myself Mrs. Hargrove probably had nieces or nephews I had never met. I texted my friend Danny, who had grown up in Larkin, and asked her if she knew the Hargroves. She took a few minutes, then wrote back which ones. I sent her the address on Creel Street. She did not reply for almost 20 minutes, and when she did she said only, "I am not really the right person to ask about that house." I sat with that for a while. Then I walked back to the hallway and looked at the photograph again. Looked at it properly this time. The two children in the picture were holding a handwritten sign. It said babysitter. Our next story. Somewhere around midnight, my bobber went under and came back up wrong, sitting too high, like something had taken the weight off the line without taking the bait. I reeled in and checked, and the worm was still there, untouched. I put it back out and told myself the current did it. There is no current on Able Lake. It is 30 acres of still, black water, and nobody fishes it at night except me. I had been coming out here for 2 seasons before I finally asked Earl at the bait shop why the lake never had other boats on it after dark. He looked at me the way people look when they have decided not to answer a question, gave me my change, and started talking about rain. I got the same non-answer from the woman who runs the laundromat and from my neighbor Dale, who has lived on the lake road his entire life. Nobody said there was anything wrong with Able Lake. They just stopped talking when I brought it up. So I kept coming. That night I heard something cross the water. Not on it. Across it, the way sound carries flat over a calm surface. Footsteps on the wooden fishing pier on the far bank, slow and evenly spaced, going from one end of the pier to the other. I watched the far shore. There are no lights over there. Nobody moved that I could see. The footsteps stopped at the end of the pier, where the boards stop and the water starts. I sat for a long time after that. When I finally pulled my gear and started the motor, I turned my flashlight toward the pier just to settle my nerves. The pier on the far bank was torn down in 1987. There is nothing there but a concrete footing and open water. Our next story. The fare request came in just as I was pulling out of a gas station on Route 9, outside this town called Millhatch that I had never heard of before that night. 3 stars, cash tip preferred. Pickup address was a gravel road I had to zoom in twice to even find on the map. I almost canceled it. The payout was good though, so I drove out. The road took me past a water tower, a shuttered diner, a church with no cars in the lot but every light inside burning. My headlights picked up a woman standing at the end of a dirt driveway, maybe 60 years old, holding a small bag. She got in without saying anything and gave me an address in the next county. I made small talk the way I always do. Asked if she was from around here. She said she used to be. I asked what Millhatch was like, just to fill the silence, and she went quiet for a long moment before she said, "People here do not really discuss the town with strangers." I laughed a little and said, "That sounds like a line from a movie." She did not laugh back. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed the address she had entered was a cemetery. I asked if she wanted me to update the destination, and she said no, that was correct, someone would meet her there. I watched her in the rear view, and she was looking out the window at nothing, just fields going dark. When I dropped her off, a man was already waiting at the gate. I do not know how he got there. There were no other cars. He looked up at me and nodded like he knew exactly who I was. Our next story. The last locker on the east corridor would not stay shut. I had pushed it closed 4 times already, and every time I turned my back, I heard the soft click of the latch releasing. I finally just left it open and moved on. I was the only one in the building. That was normal for a Thursday close. I had done this shift for 6 years at Deller Creek Middle, and the quiet never bothered me. The fluorescents hummed, the furnace ticked, and the mop bucket wheels squeaked on the linoleum, and that was all there was. I was halfway down the south hall when I noticed the trophy case. The glass was fogged from the inside, like a warm breath had pressed against it. I thought maybe the heating vent above it was misbehaving. But the vent was across the hall. I stood there looking at it for a moment, then kept moving. The photograph was what stopped me a second time. There is a row of class photos going back to 1974, hung in the main entrance. I had walked past them 1,000 times. But the photo for 1989 was different that night. Not tilted, not damaged. Just different. There was a face in the back row I did not recognize. A girl, pale, hair parted down the middle, looking at the camera like the camera owed her something. I had never noticed her before. I asked the principal about it the next morning. She looked at the photo for a long time without saying anything. Then she said the building burned to the ground in 1989, and every photo from that year was lost in the fire. Our next story. Halfway through my log entry for 11 p.m., I noticed the same pickup truck parked on the service road below for the third night running. I was volunteering at the Kellerton Fire Lookout for a forestry rotation, 4 nights on, 3 nights off, and the job was mostly quiet. You count lightning strikes, you radio smoke coordinates, you drink bad coffee and watch the dark. The service road below the tower was for emergency vehicles only, gated, and I had the only key. The truck was the same one. White cab, 1 taillight out on the left. I recognized it because on the first night I thought it might be another volunteer coming to check on equipment, but nobody ever got out. I called down to the county office. The woman on dispatch paused for longer than felt normal before she told me the road was probably just used by locals who knew the old gate code. She said it like she wanted me to accept it and move on. I did mostly. On the 4th night the truck was there again, and this time the engine was off. No lights at all. I trained my binoculars on it for a while and then stopped because a figure was standing just outside the tree line beside it, facing the tower. Standing completely still. I told myself it was a deer, the way you do. I mentioned it to the guy who relieved me in the morning. He listened without asking any questions, which was the part that bothered me. Most people ask questions. He just nodded slowly and said that road has always had visitors, and it is better if you do not log them. I had already logged them. When I checked my notebook that afternoon, those 3 pages were gone. Our next story. 7 houses into my route, Cooper sat down on the sidewalk and refused to move. He was a beagle, 5 years old, not prone to drama. He would walk through thunderstorms without flinching. But every morning without fail, he stopped at the corner of Aldridge and Marsh and would not cross. I had chalked it up to some smell I could not detect. A dead animal under the storm drain, something like that. Dogs know things noses know. That morning I crouched beside him and looked down Marsh Street while he trembled against my knee. The street was empty the way streets are at 4:30 in the morning. Porch lights on, cars in driveways, nothing moving. Except that the house on the far end, the white colonial with the peeling shutters, had every light on inside. Every room. Ground floor, second floor, the small round attic window. All of them burning bright. I had never seen a single light on in that house. I mentioned it to the woman who owned Cooper when I dropped him off. She took him inside quickly and started to close the door before I finished the sentence. I asked if she knew who lived there. She said the house had been empty for years. Then she said she had to get ready for work. I checked the county property records that afternoon, the kind you can pull up for free online. The house on the far end of Marsh Street last transferred ownership in 2009. The name on the deed matched the name on the small memorial cross planted in the yard, the one I had always assumed was for a pet. I drove past that evening. The cross was gone. Our next story. On my second morning snowed in, I noticed the Pelletier house across the road had a light on in the upstairs window. That was strange because the Pelletiers had been gone since October, and everyone in Creston knew it. I had watched them load the moving truck myself. so I assumed I had the wrong house. Checked the angles. Double check. No, that was definitely the Pelletier place, yellow clapboard with the green shutters, and the light was on in what I remembered as a child's bedroom. I texted my neighbor Dana, who had lived on Birch Run Road for 30 years. She replied in about 4 minutes. Just said that house gets like that sometimes, and then nothing more when I wrote back asking what she meant. I watched the window most of the afternoon. The light never changed, never moved. Solid and still like a lamp with a shade. On the third day the snow was too deep to walk in, so I was still just watching from my front room. A man I did not recognize walked up the driveway of the Pelletier house around noon, unlocked the front door with a key, and went inside. I called Dana. She let it ring. I called another neighbor, Bill Farnham, and he picked up, and when I described what I was seeing he went very quiet and then said, "I would just leave that one alone if I were you," and hung up. The man came out an hour later carrying nothing. He locked the door behind him. He walked back down the driveway and turned up the road and disappeared into the white. I checked the county records that evening. The Pelletier house sold in November. It sold to a man whose name matched the one on my own lease. Our next story. The chart on bed 4 said the patient had been admitted under observation. No family listed, no emergency contact, no town of residence. Just a name, Gerald Oakes, and an age, 61. I noticed it during my first round at midnight because the column for hometown was not left blank. It had been filled in and then crossed out with a single black line, neat and deliberate, like someone had thought about it. I asked the charge nurse from the previous shift about it before she left. She zipped her bag and said Gerald was a quiet one, not to worry. She did not look at me when she said it. He was awake when I checked his vitals at 1. He had the kind of stillness that comes from years of practice, not peace. I asked how he was feeling and he said fine, and then he said, "You are not from here, are you?" I told him I had transferred from the county facility 2 months ago. He nodded like that explained something. At 2:30 I passed his room and he was sitting up, facing the window that looked onto the parking lot. I almost kept walking. Then I noticed he was mouthing words, slowly, the same short phrase over and over, and his hands were flat on the blanket like he was bracing. I leaned in the doorway and asked if he needed anything. He turned and looked at me for a long moment and said, "They crossed it out so you would not look it up." He was discharged before my shift ended, a man I never saw sign any paperwork, walking him out by the elbow at 4 in the morning. The hometown column on his chart now just says resolved. Our next story. A man checked in around 9, paid cash, signed the register with a name I could not quite read. Happens more than you would think at a place like the Pine View. I gave him room 7 and went back to my crossword. What made me look up was the quiet. Around 11, the couple in room 4 usually has their television on, some home renovation show with a lot of excited voices. That night there was nothing. I figured they were asleep early. Then the man from room 7 came back to the desk. He had not been gone as far as I knew. The door had not opened. I heard no footsteps on the walkway outside. He was just standing there looking at the pegboard where I keep the spare keys, and he said, "Do you still put the Mitchell family in room 7? I told him I did not know any Mitchell family. He nodded like that was the answer he expected and walked back outside. I asked my manager about it the next morning. She went very still and said the Mitchells had not been a family for a long time and that people from out of town sometimes came through asking about them and that we did not talk about it. She said this the way you say it when you mean especially not to guests. I looked up the name that night. I found a small article from 1987, a family of 3 who had rented a room at this property back when it was called something else. They had never checked out. The case was listed as open. Room 7 is the only room where we do not keep a spare key on the pegboard. Our next story. Dispatch sent me to Cutter Creek Road at 11:30, a single package for a house I had never seen on my route before. The gravel out there turns to dirt after the second cattle gate, and my headlights were throwing long shadows through the pine rows when I noticed all the mailboxes had been turned to face the ditch. Not knocked over. Turned. Deliberately angled down, every single one, maybe a dozen of them in a row. I told myself kids do dumb things. I found the address, a low white house set back from the road with one yellow light burning in the front window, and I walked the package to the door. A woman answered before I knocked. She was already holding the door open, looking past me at the truck rather than at me, and she said my first name. Not sir, not hey. My actual name, which is not printed anywhere on my uniform. I asked if we had met before. She said she had been expecting me, took the package, and closed the door without signing. I sat in the truck for a minute, trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe dispatch gave her a driver profile. Maybe she recognized me from town. I was almost convinced by the time I reached the end of Cutter Creek and turned back onto the main road. There was a man standing at the first mailbox. He was not doing anything, just standing there with one hand resting on top of it. I slowed down and he turned to watch me pass, and in the glow of my taillights, I could see he had turned the mailbox back up to face the road. I looked at my manifest when I got back to the depot. Cutter Creek Road had not been on my route. Our next story. A woman pulled up to pump 2 at 3:15, which was already strange because nobody comes through Ardell after midnight except truckers, and they all know to use the diesel bays. I watched her through the window for a minute before I went out. She was just standing beside her car, not pumping anything, staring at the corn across the road. I asked if she needed help. She turned around and she looked fine, calm, no distress I could name. She asked me how far it was to Minner Lake. I told her Minner Lake was about 9 miles east, and she nodded like she already knew that. Then she asked me if they ever found the boy. I grew up in Ardell. I have worked this station for 6 years. There is a thing that people here do not discuss, a rule that nobody wrote down but everyone follows, and it has to do with Minner Lake and a period of about 2 weeks back in 1987, when apparently things happened that the older residents will not name. I know this because I tried to ask once, and 3 separate people gave me the exact same response, word for word. They said there was nothing to tell. I told the woman I did not know what she meant. She looked at me for a moment and then she smiled, not unkindly, and she got back in her car. She had not bought anything. She had not pumped any gas. I watched her pull out, heading east toward Minner Lake. At 5 in the morning, my relief came in, and I mentioned the woman, and he went quiet in the particular way that people in Ardell go quiet. He said he had never seen anyone come through here that late. The Pump 2 security tape showed only an empty lot.